Well, welcome again to another opportunity for questions and answers here at the briefing room in Reporoa, New Zealand. I have as my guest Bob Cornuke. Chuck is still in the States, and so we have Bob Cornuke via video link. Bob, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Ron.
Bob, we were with you about a month or so ago, and myself, Chuck, and you had a discussion about your new book called Temple, Could History Be So Stunningly Wrong? And we have a lot of questions that have come in from our audience with regards to that, and we'll get to that because obviously that's created quite a firestorm. But before we get into that, I wanted to begin the evening with an opportunity for our viewing audience to get to know you a little bit. So give us a quick background as to how did you get into this interesting business of going around the world being the Christian version of Indiana Jones?
Well, I don't think I want them to get to know me because then I'd lose all credibility. I don't have this real stellar background of a scholar. My background really comes from being a police officer in the Los Angeles, Orange County area. And I was a SWAT team member out there, and I was a crime scene investigator, did homicide investigators and such. And after I left the police department, I think I had a pretty good skill of investigating, finding evidence. And I just use those skills now to look for lost locations in the Bible, looking for subjects such as Noah's Ark and Mount Sinai, Ark of the Covenant, Paul's Shipwreck, more recently the Temple, things like that. And apparently people like these subject matters, so I've been writing books and doing videos, speaking around the country and the world. I was with you in England, and New Zealand and whatnot. So I really think I don't have a typical background for anything. It's sort of, I jumped into police work, then I jumped into doing Bible archeology and investigations. And after 28 years of investigations and 55 expeditions later, I'm sitting here talking to you tonight.
Right. Well, the big move in your life from police work into biblical archaeology was a pretty famous guy. Tell us about the connection with James Eran.
Yeah, pretty famous. I mean, he, you could say he's one of history's elite. He was the 8th man to walk on the moon and the first one to drive the car on the moon. And when Jim came back from looking for, up on the moon, he came back and he said after his NASA career, he said, I want to look for lost locations in the Bible. So he started looking for such things as Noah's Ark. He looks for things as the Exodus route, the Exodus crossing site. And he asked me to participate in those expeditions. Of course, that's pretty exciting stuff. And then after a while, I started getting really skilled, I think, in traveling. And then Jim passed away in 1991, and I sort of picked up the mantle, and I've been sort of doing these expeditions ever since.
So let's pick up the first sort of passion that Jim Eran had was to find Noah's Ark. I mean, there's been a lot of expedition, especially around this singular mountain in Turkey, Mount Ararat. And tell us a little bit about some of your early expedition work that you did with James Eran, and what were your findings? People, there's been a lot of videos done on this. A lot of people saying they've found it here and there, and national parks being set up in Turkey, and all sorts of different things.
Right.
But what have you discovered, and how much effort have you put into to try to discover, Noah's Ark?
Well, I've put a lot of time looking for Noah's Ark. I tell you, I hate looking for Noah's Ark. It's cold up there. The wind's whipping. You've got terrorists up there. There's avalanches going off. You get up early morning and you hike all day until your legs can't even take it anymore. It's a very dangerous endeavor. But the payoff is so big that it forces you on. You say, well, gosh, if I find Noah's Ark, it's going to change the world. And people are going to come and flock to churches and say, oh, the Ark's been found and it'll change. Probably that won't happen. I mean, a lot of people won't even even if you prove it's Noah's Ark, they probably won't even say that it's Noah's Ark. We hope that it would, but it probably wouldn't. But because of that, there's been so many eyewitnesses that if I've actually been on the mountain with two people standing next to me, and one sees the Ark over there and the other one sees the Ark over there at the same time. That mountain is basaltic, it's volcanic, and you think you see Noah's Ark all the time because there's a straight line and a shadow. Your mind registers and calibrates it to being Noah's Ark. But Noah's Ark hasn't been found. And more tragically of late, I think in the last 10 years, there's been so many frauds that have been put out there that we have actually checked on and found that they're bona fide frauds that are not Noah's Ark. And but people plant evidence because they're so desperate to either have a great find or a great find that'll show that God is really, real. So it's a weird group of people that look for Noah's Ark. It's more fun looking at the people that look for Noah's Ark and the people that are actually looking for Noah's Ark because it's strange why we do that. All of us have our own agendas, and sadly, the search for Noah's Ark often is almost comical and fraudulent.
Well, the most of the attention that has been paid has been focused on this mountain in Turkey called Ararat, but you chose to look in the mountains of Iran. Why?
Well, we were all looking at Ararat, and I asked the other Ark searchers one day. I said, just at a symposium thing, why are we looking on Mount Ararat? And they said, well, that's where Noah's Ark is. And I said, do we know that this is the mountains of Ararat? And they said, well, yeah, because it's been said that for a long time. Well, so I started doing research on when it got to be called Mount Ararat in Turkey as the mountain of the Ark. And it really started with a guy by the name of Marco Polo. Marco Polo went through that area, was told by the local indigenous people who just had their Bibles translated, and they pointed up and said, that big mountain is where the Ark is up there. We think. We read the Bible, it says it's in a big mountain, so that must be it. So Marco Polo's journals just went wild in Europe. And because they became widely disseminated in Europe, it became ensconced in our culture that has to be the mountain. And no one's even questioned it. But when you really look in scripture, such as Genesis 11:1 and 2, it says that the descendants, it doesn't say Noah, but it's before Nimrod, the fourth generation of Noah, that they journeyed from the east and they settled in Shinar. Well, Shinar is the Mesopotamia Valley, Baghdad for all intents and purposes. And coming east from there, you'd be coming from the northern mountains of Iran, and Turkey is to the northwest. So this is to the east. So we have ancient historians such as Josephus saying it's in the area of the Parthians, and we have others, Julius Africanus, Nicholas Damascus, saying it's in the area of the Mannai tribes, which is in Iran. So I just said, why don't we just broaden the scope and look in these areas that historians and the Bible seems to be saying. But so many people are just looking through this narrow tube at Ararat, and they're not willing to lift off their eyesight to any other potential alternative sites. And I have done that. I think I'm the only one that's ever done that. Most people are just all looking for Ararat as the mountain.
And then you led a number of expeditions to various sites in Iran. And how many expeditions did you lead to various sites in Iran?
I've been to Iran 5 times and arrested there twice in the search. They don't like Christians walking around with Bibles way out in the hinterlands. So I was thrown in jail twice over there. And the last trip I took Josh McDowell and Frank Turek and some real notables that were with us, the president of Avis Rental Car, the former president of Avis Rental Car.
Right.
And so we went over there and we found this object that had petrified wood all over it, and people have said to me, tell people it's Noah's Ark. And I said, you can't tell them it's Noah's Ark. We found something very interesting that the locals claim is Noah's Ark. That the lures of the lure tribe is said to be Noah's Ark, but can we prove it? No. So it's one of those things where I have a high standard. If I make a proclamation, it has to be a high standard. You know me a long time. I cannot just loosey-goosey say this is it. No, we have to know what it is, and that it's a very unique object. It deserves further investigation, but it's certainly, I can't say it's Noah's Ark.
I mean, I have to admit that after you had gone up there with Josh McDowell and others, there was a video that was produced, and parts of it were on YouTube. And I must admit, I had a good look at it, and it's in a very provocative place, some place that you wouldn't expect some massive wooden structure to be
Yeah.
positioned on the top of a mountain in such a peculiar way. The thing you couldn't determine from, what you could determine was that it was petrified wood, and it was a large amount of it, but you couldn't necessarily identify that it was a boat structure or anything like that. Is that correct?
That's right, because Ron, we just don't know what the ark looks like. I know the Bible gives us a description, about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. It's given in cubits, 300 cubits by 50 cubits kind of thing. So we know generally. And then people have said, well, it has 3 decks on it. The Bible doesn't say 3 decks. It says it has a lower, a middle, and an upper. And so, but people have an assumptive interpretation that means decks. It very well could mean decks, but it doesn't necessarily mean so. And then the ark had a covering on it that Noah put back the covering, on the ark. Well, the same word for the covering is used for the covering on the tabernacle, which was animal skins. So the top of the ark could have just been covered with all these animal skins. It could have been on this logs that were lashed together and dipped in oil like a floating raft, and then cages put atop it. It could have been a very ugly object, nothing like we would think that artists do by painting big beams on the top of it. Beams are for snow loads. It didn't need any to support any. It just needed to have a tarp that washed away the water. So, we just don't know what the ark looks like, or the Ark of the Covenant for that matter. We're giving these very sketchy descriptions, and we as humans want to put in and connect the dots, and so we start getting artists that draw these things, and then we start accepting them culturally based on what the artists say instead of what the Bible really describes.
And of course, we've jumped from one ark to another, and I see on the back table there, your credenza at the back, you've got an artist representation of the Ark of the Covenant, and of course, the Raiders of the Lost Ark popularized the idea of trying to find it somewhere in Egypt, and there are those who have postulated that it's still in Jerusalem in a cave. There are some rabbis that hold that view, but you hold a different view with regards to the location of the Ark of the Covenant, don't you, Bob?
Yeah, then again, it's one of those subjects that if you really start dismantling it, we start following urban legends and traditions more than we do what the Bible actually says or what history actually says. But the Ark of the Covenant is one of those things that, of course, they call it the jewel of archaeology, the plum of archaeology. The movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, of course, that's people are pretty excited about finding it via Harrison Ford going after it. But I believe the Ark of the Covenant was an object that has slipped past the scrutiny of historians, and it took a unique route and left Israel and went to Egypt, to the Nile River, to Elephantine Island, and it was taken out during the time of Manasseh, who was a real nutcake. Manasseh was about as evil as they come. He was a crazy guy, psychotic, sociopathic, crazy man. He practiced wizardry, sorcery, put his son through the fires. And during that time, the loyal Levitical priests wouldn't have been able to stomach it. They wouldn't have tolerated all that he did, bringing pagan idols by the ark, and would have taken it out. And so we know that the ark was in the temple in 701 BC when Hezekiah prayed before the ark, when Sennacherib had Jerusalem surrounded. And then the Manasseh came on the scene. He practiced wizardry, sorcery, all that crazy stuff. And then Josiah, Josiah comes, young guy, good guy. He's saying, put the holy ark in the temple. It shall no longer be a burden on your shoulders anymore, which means that the ark is gone and it's on the shoulders of someone being carried outside of Jerusalem. And so we believe that to be Elephantine Island because we have archaeologists, secular archaeologists, talking about the Elephantine papyri, about them doing blood sacrifices in Egypt and Elephantine Island. And then at that very time, we have a legend in Ethiopia of the ark coming to Tanakirkos Island about 400 BC. And then it stayed on that island for 800 years. Then it was transported to Axum, Ethiopia, where it still is said to be there today. I've been over to Axum 20 times. I'm going there again fairly soon. And I've gotten to know the monks over there and the priests, and I get this sort of the inside scoop. I go out to dinner with them, get to know them, and I help their children through school and take them to the hospitals and and give them medical attention, and I'm considered one of the family over there. So they won't tell anybody about the Ark in Ethiopia, but they have taken me aside and said in the dark shadows when no one was listening, and they've told me exactly what it looks like and exactly what it is, and it's really unique to have that kind of inside knowledge that they've told me. But I believe they really do have, they either have the Ark of the Covenant or they have a replica that they believe to be the Ark for 2,000 years, but they have something that's magnificent. And I've been told what it looks like exactly, where it sits. I even helped design the new building that they just put it in. So I have a pretty good handhold with the Ethiopians, especially the Ark of the Covenant. I'm amazed. I think they really, if I had to guess on what side of the fence I need to fall on, I'd fall on the side that they really do have the actual Ark of the Covenant.
Right, and there's a compound which they there's an elder that's sort of responsible for it, and he goes in and never comes out, and he's replaced only after he dies. And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, people say to me, well, Bob, if you know him so well, and why don't you just go in there? Why doesn't somebody just go in the building and take this thing? And it's not as simple as that. This thing is so holy to them that my laying my eyes on it would only the guardian is the only guy allowed to see it. Even the head of the patriarch of the church, the Orthodox Church, can't even go in and see the thing. But people that have seen it, and the guardians, I've known two of them, they're the only ones allowed to see it. When they die, they'll appoint another guardian. But they've actually trickled out information to me about what it looks like and where it sets and what kind of sarcophagus it's in. They say it's in a big stone sarcophagus that has silver lining that's very ornate, and two stone doors that close on a pivot pin. And they describe it in great detail. It's made out of acacia wood. People think that the Ark is made out of gold. It's made out of wood, and it's laminated with gold. And the top part of the Ark is pure gold, of hammered gold, with two winged creatures on the top called cherubim that face each other, and it looks more like a throne. We actually just wrote a book about it. The mercy seat being the throne of Christ and the messianic reign. That's going to take about 2 hours to explain that one, but we have a book out on that as well.
Right. Let's move on to another subject for which you got your first real international attention, and that's when you and Larry Williams snuck into Saudi Arabia and had quite an adventure there. Tell us what that was all about.
Well, we didn't sneak in, Ron. We used creative methods, which some people describe as sneaking in. That's one of those things where Larry Williams, whose daughter is Michelle Williams, the famous actress, has 2 Academy Award nominations. Larry, Commodities Trader of the Year in the Wall Street Journal, very famous guy, ran for United States Senator. Larry comes to me and says, I've got all this money. Let's go try and find the real Mount Sinai. We had heard from a couple of men that had been there before us that they had found this mountain. They got arrested. They were not going to go back. And so Jim Eran came and said, this is a very high-risk mission, but would you go on it? And I did. We went into Saudi Arabia. We did sneak in. And we got across the desert, about 200-some miles back in the desert. And there was this mountain with this mountain peak that was all scorched black. The locals called it Jebel Musa, or the Mountain of Moses. Around the mountain there was all these altars and pillars and caves and things all mentioned in the Bible. A big altar where we think they made the golden calf with the bull god inscribed on it, and they right against the mountain there was a place where they did burnt offerings and where they had the animals and corralled and stuff. And then years later, Jim and Penny Caldwell found what is, I think, is the most amazing thing, the split rock at Horeb. They get full credit for that, the best find over there. And then since then, there have been artifacts found around the mountain, such as menorahs and ancient writings, which lead us to believe that that is the real Mount Sinai, where Moses received the 10 Commandments. Galatians 4:25 says, now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, so we need to look in Arabia for Mount Sinai. We don't need to look in the Sinai Peninsula. That's all tradition. But Matthew, we have Galatians 4:25 and other verses in the Bible saying it's in the ancient land of Midian or Madian, and that's in Saudi Arabia. So we need to look in those locations.
So
where the Bible directs us.
So in all three instances, both the Noah's Ark, the Ark of the Covenant, and Mount Sinai, the thing that seems to prevent people from finding the authentic thing is their own myopia, isn't it? The own sense of tunnel vision that they get because of tradition. And you know, as an investigator, you have to unpick a lot of that sort of thinking, don't you? Tell us the process you go through when you are trying to look for something that has been looked for by many other people over hundreds of years.
Well, Ron, as I'm getting older, I'm realizing it's not so much that people don't want to look at other locations. I think that people are a lot of times dissatisfied with locations, and they really question them. I'm sure a lot of the audience have said, "Wait a second, how could the children of Israel get drowned in 1 foot of water, in the Gulf of Suez when it says that the mighty waters, drowned the Egyptian army?" Well, that would be the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea. So people have always questioned. But the thing about scholars is they want three things: they want prestige, they want to be promoted, and they want to be published. And if you start messing with anything to do with the status quo, you often get persecuted and you get ridiculed, and your peers will sort of mock you. The best course is to stay in the safe harbor of mutual consent. So what happens is the greatest discoveries in the world have been those that have been willing to risk getting humiliated and really dissected and fall into the intellectual wood chipper of these scholars who are very almost vicious kind of people in some respect. Because when you start stepping on what they consider to be holy ground, if they've written a book about it or they've taken tours over there, they get almost vicious towards you if you say anything different. So what I think a lot of scholars do is they just don't want to rock the boat. And so that leaves a wide open field for guys like me that say, okay, I'm willing to go out there and get punched in the nose with the intellectual fist. And I have. But but I think the truth is out there if you follow the Bible and use the Bible as the final mediator and arbitrator in all this, and don't follow man's traditions. Jesus says in Mark 7:13, your traditions will nullify the word of God, and we need to stay away from the traditions and following what the Bible says as the final map and as the final guide for any of this.
Well, one of the characteristics, Bob, certainly in getting to know you and understanding some of the expeditions you've gone on and some of the things you've been exploring, is that you invest yourself and put yourself at risk. Going back to the time that you were in Saudi Arabia, you knew that the area around Jebel al-Awls and that area, you came across some very interesting and now pretty well known findings in that area. But in your book, it's the Mountain of Fire, right? Isn't that what it's called, your book?
Well, my book is Relic Quest, but the video is Mountain of Fire.
The Mountain of Fire, yes. And in that, there's a story where you're finally arrested. You're trying to get out of the country, and you're arrested by some of these nomadic policemen, and they take you to the police headquarters, and you, as far as you're concerned, it's pretty much over, isn't it? They could have killed you in the desert, and no one would have ever known. But tell us a story, because you're famous for what you and Larry pulled something off there that is of epic proportion. Tell us about how you got out of that prison in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I've endured 5 arrests in the Middle East, and they're all pretty scary, each one of them. But this one was the most scary of them all, because Larry and I had left the mountain. It was 128 degrees that day in Jeddah, so it was a hot day. We had gotten the photos, and we said, look, these photos are going to change archaeology as we know it. This is the real Mount Sinai. And more scholars today are saying that's the real Mount Sinai than the one in Saudi Arabia and in the Sinai Peninsula. So we have a lot of people saying that it's in Jabal al-Awz, our mountain. But when we're going away, we got lost, and a Bedouin happened upon us, and we asked him, how do we find the asphalt road? Because there's only one road that goes through that area of Saudi Arabia, the northern part, and it goes to Tabuk, and that's where our hotel was. And so we're hundreds of miles away, and running low on gas and water and everything else, and getting a little nervous out in the desert. happened across this Bedouin, and he took us and said, "Follow me." He took us to a prison, a police station, and it was just a mud-walled building, corrugated tin roof, rusty old crumbling thing. And guys came out with guns, and they're dressed in robes and goatees and no uniforms. They call themselves police, but they had the old Bedouin robes. And they put guns to our heads. They threw us in a cell. We sat in there for hour after hour. They took our shoes off, our keys off of us, our passports. They put them in the middle of the floor. The floor was crawling with ants. The ants were all over us. They put guns to our heads. They spit on us. They called us Jews, and we had the definite opinion that they were going to kill us. And then Larry had the wild idea and said, we're doctors. He stood up and pointed to me and said, "We're doctors." And so the guard said, "Are you a doctor?" I said, "Well, looked at Larry. Larry said, "Yeah." I said, "Yes." And so they all had sickness. That one guy had a red eye that was infected, and another guy had a bad back and a cut hand. So I went out and got my shave kit from the truck. They followed me out with a gun to my head. Went out and got the shave kit, came back, and in the shave kit I had some Visine, which gave the guy, his eye went away that was all infected. And then the other guy came up and he wanted medicine for bad back, so I gave him sleeping pills. We had a bottle of these real high-powered sleeping pills that a doctor gave us. He said, "If you're in the mountain, you have diarrhea, sickness, infection," they say, here's some sleeping pills. So he gave us sleeping pills. We gave him 5 of them to the one guy. The next guy came up. I gave him 5. The next guy came up. I gave him 5. To make a long story short, I don't know what happened to those guys, and I want to apologize to the families out there for any long-term effects to them, but they went to sleep in about 15 minutes, and it helped us get to a place where we could escape. And there's been several books written about it. Now I don't know how many books, I've lost count, and Hollywood wants to do a movie on this story, so it's kind of crazy, but we escaped.
Right. When I met you in England, you had just come back from your latest discovery at that time was the anchors associated with the shipwreck of Paul. And again, that was another thing where through church tradition, they were looking in St. Paul's Bay in the Isle of Malta, and you came to a whole different conclusion. Tell us what you came up with, and how you were able to come up with that new location and something that was quite amazing.
Well, I'd like to say it's because I'm this brilliant explorer, but I'm not. It's so funny, all these things, but we do all this research, and I thought it was in Marshallock Bay, which was in the south end of the island, and I did a lot of research and diving there. And then after not finding anything, I went back to the hotel that night, and my pastor came with on the trip with his wife. It was very hot, and the bells were going off in the church, and she couldn't sleep from the bells going off every 15 minutes, dong, 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 all night long. And so we had to go over to St. Thomas Bay, which is a nicer hotel with air conditioning. And so I'm not used to that. When I travel, it's pretty hardy. So when you bring your pastor and his wife along, they expect a mint on the pillow at night. So I'm out there, and there's a dive shop while I'm waiting where we're checking in, and I'm kind of a little bit irked that her lack of being tolerant to the weather and the sound. So I'm there outside, and there's a dive shop there, and a generator's going off, a compressor. And so I go in the dive shop and start talking. I said, "Hey, I'm doing this research on the anchors and the 4 anchors of Paul, and they were found at 90 feet, and where 2 seas coming together, and I described the whole thing, and the guy's eyes got big and go, "Well, what you're describing is the Munshar Reef." And I said, "Well, where is it?" He goes, "Well, it's right out there." And I said, "Well, in 90 feet of water, I'm going to pay. We're going to go out there. We're going to find these anchors." He goes, "We already found the anchors, 4 of them, exactly in 90 feet of water, exactly where Luke described in the Bible." So we had the anchors inspected by Dr. Bonanno from the University of Malta, and he goes, "Yeah, these are first century anchors, probably off an Alexandrian grain freighter, the same ship that Paul was on. 4 anchors, they've never found 4 anchors in the Mediterranean Sea ever. They found the 4 anchors exactly where 2 seas come together, Luke says, and top up the 1,000, in front of a reef with the bay of the beach behind us, and everything fit 100%. And so we did a video on it, and now there's a lot of people that are saying that those are the anchors from Paul's shipwreck. And I'm pretty convinced that they are. There's nothing we can say for sure, but I give that one a real high 95% those are the anchors in Paul's Shipwreck.
Well, I was there with you, and of course, when you presented them to the Maritime Museum, and it was an interesting struggle between the curators of the museum. They really didn't want to acknowledge them, and then there was a few others that were from I think the Department of Antiquity or something. There was a young fellow there that seemed to be more supportive, and I think that's pretty typical, isn't it? When you start going against the status quo, you're going to have people that will push back just because they have so much invested in it.
Well, and in Malta, the beloved character there is Paul, and the famous event is Paul crashing on their island. But I talked to the priests. They said in about the year 1200, when they beat the Muslims and the Normans came in and kicked the Muslims out, that they needed a place to venerate, to worship as the place of Paul's shipwreck. So they picked a bay that was very close to the harbor, the main harbor, and to the capital city. And so they picked this place, and it was not based on the Bible, but it was based on just convenience. And then, of course, it became rooted in their culture. So when I come along and say, oh, it should be in the south end of the island, there was a big meeting that I went on last time, and the guy said, well, why are you looking there? I said, the Bible said. He goes, well, forget the Bible. The Bible's a bunch of old, old stories and a bunch of old myths. He goes, we don't follow that. We have a tradition. I said, well, I follow what the Bible said. And he goes, oh, that's ridiculous. And they literally laughed at me for following the Bible as a guide.
Right. Well, now, of course, your latest book, The Temple, really hasn't created the firestorm that you expected. In fact, as you were saying before we got on to the broadcast, that there's more acceptance of this alternative than any of your previous four adventures of people embracing the idea of the real Temple Mount being south of what we call the Temple Mount today. What's been the reaction from the academic community and the theologians? What sort of feedback have you received from your book?
Well, kind of like the Earth is not the center of the universe, and everybody comes along and says so. That it's so. And when I was doing research on where the temple is located, every book, every encyclopedia, every book that I picked up as a source material on to do research said that it's uncontested as being the Temple Mount, as being the place of the temple. There's no other place that's even thought of as being it. And so doing the research on it, I was really out there alone on this big empty sea trying to prove that the temple of Solomon and of Herod was not on the Temple Mount. That's being fought over today. It's in the news almost every day, but that actually the temple is in the city of David. And the Bible, you've heard the presentation around the biblical evidence and the extra biblical evidence for this is so over the top that I don't know why people have not thought of this before. They really did. Ernest Martin did a book on this. Ken Klein did a video on this, and there's a lot of people that have done some stuff on this. But I really just coalesced it into a book that's readable and then added a lot more of my own research. Came up with a book called The Temple, which I think proves that the Temple of Solomon is not on the Temple Mount, but was literally in the city of David. And I haven't had one scholar call me up and say I'm wrong on this. So it's pretty interesting that I have had so much silence on this from critics.
Right, because everything else, the real Sinai being in Saudi Arabia versus the Sinai Peninsula, the Ark, Noah's Ark being in Iran rather than Mount Ararat in Turkey, the idea of the Ark of the Covenant not being in some cave in Israel someplace, but being in Ethiopia. All of these things are things that could have been controversial, or the anchors of Paul being on the south side of the island rather than around the north side of the island in a very convenient bay. In all instances, you have people that you received pushback, but this one seems to resonate with people. We've had a number of people that in anticipation of this program have written us And some just to simply say, they don't have a question, but just to simply say that in reading your book or hearing from these two programs that we've talked about this issue, that it really resonates with them. Somehow it just seems right in terms of so much of the other scripture lines up because of that. Has that been your experience over this last? It's been less than a year, really, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's about 6 months for the book, I think. But the book is the book's really been received well. I'm going over to Israel, and I'm meeting with some top scholars and top government officials from the United States and from Israel. I mean, top officials that want to talk about the temple and what it means for it to be in the city of David, how it might actually impact the relations between the Muslims and the Jews. And so it's kind of fun to see the book get read by some of the top scholars and people in the world, and they're excited about what it really is implying.
Yes. Let me just pause for this moment. I want to give our viewers an opportunity to link up with both you and Koinonia Institute. If you're watching this program either live now or later through kitrust.org or through YouTube, encourage you to go to facebook.com and like /Base Institute as one of the Facebook places to go and like and follow it, choose to follow it. And the same is true for Koinonia House, facebook.com /Koinonia House. So both of them, Base Institute, like and follow those, and do the same with Koinonia House, and you'll be able to get the information like this. Bob, as we look at the time, I know we have a lot of questions here that I want to get to. Many of them are associated with this. But they're of a lot of the same types. Here's one from Lynn. She writes and says, Mr. Cornuke, what reaction have you had from the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem regarding your findings on the location of the original temple? Do they seem to be open to accepting the possibility that the temple was in the city of David, or are you getting a lot of resistance? So from the Jewish standpoint, I remember when you and I went down to, when we were there some months ago, we went to the Western Wall and were doing some filming there, and had quite an interesting set of conversations, didn't we, with the Orthodox that were going there at the hour of prayer. Tell our viewers about that.
Well, it's kind of like, right, it's kind of like going to San Antonio and saying, okay, the Alamo is really in Austin. And the first reaction is, of course, going to be a visceral response of almost anger. But then when you start, the wonderful thing about the temple thing is when you sit down and you start talking and people start looking into what the Bible has to say or the Tanakh has to say with the Jews, and then we start analyzing it. There's an incredible acceptance. I gave a talk in New Hampshire recently, and they invited a lot of the Jewish community to come. And I started my talk and said, I'm going to be talking about the temple being in the city of David. And just saying that, a family stood up, took the two children by the hand, and they went out of the sanctuary. And as a protest of what I was about to say, not hearing what I had to say, but as a protest. And I understand that's a very dear, cherished tradition that they have and believe. But there were a lot of Jews that stayed and sat towards the front, off to my left as I was speaking to the audience. At the end, a hand went up. First question. And obviously a Jewish man, the big beard, and he stood up and said, I'm Jewish, and I want to apologize for that family walking out. He goes, and I want to apologize to everyone in this room because we have just not inspected, the writings in the Tanakh, and that I believe that you're right about the temple location. And the next man stood up next to him and said, I'm Jewish, and I believe you as well. He goes, I believe that it's not on the Temple Mount, that it's in the city of David. And so there was tears in the audience. There was tears in my eyes because the sincerity in which they said it and the risk that they took in front of the community in saying that was kind of an overwhelming moment. It was kind of an emotional moment for all of us. So I've had some great encouragement from the Jewish community and the Jews that I've spoken to.
Well, we certainly, when we were there on the Temple Mount filming and discussing and talking we found that there were sort of two general reactions. One from the older segment, which was very hostile. I mean, you were called all kinds of names, I remember. And then there was a younger group of guys that kind of surrounded you for 30 minutes, and they were engaging you. And I think to some degree, that shows the young mind is willing to accept young ideas and fresh ideas, where the older that have invested, they have that emotional capital, that investment that's there, that it's difficult for them to move away from. And with all of these expeditions that you've been on, I guess you have to take a fresh view to all of this, or else you'll just suffer from the same myopia as everybody else.
Right. I'm finding, especially, I did a straw poll the year before, or months before we were there, Ron, and I had a little bit different response than I did the time that we were there talking. And I don't know if it was just when we were there, just the groups that we hit, but I'd say 95% of the younger crowd, but I'm talking about younger, 25 and below, all said, cool. The temple can be rebuilt, and it's in the city of David, and they all got around and were very excited about it. But anybody 40 and above told me, there's nothing you can tell me. You remember me asking there, is there anything I can tell you that's going to sway you from this? And they said, no, there's nothing you can tell me.
Right.
They're calcified in their belief, and the dump truck of tradition has gone over them and dumped a huge load of cement long ago, and there's nothing that's going to change them. But these younger guys are all excited about the city of David as being the potential temple. So I think the next generation might have a more open viewpoint on it than we have today.
Well, and it may come faster than we think. We have a statement and then a question from Brian. He writes, he says, I've always suspected in my heart that the wall, in inverted commas, is not there where the temple once stood. After reading Bob's book, I'm happy to know this gut feeling has been vindicated. But I find it very hard to believe that there are few people or none in Israel who has figured this out, unless this is part of the great corporate blindness that Jesus proclaimed upon entering Jerusalem. But if there are any, my question is this. Are there no Jewish advocacy groups in Israel who are putting out the message to their countrymen that the proper location of the temple is across the street?
I don't know of any advocacy groups that are doing that. I do know, for instance, I was over there with a very famed archaeologist who found the coin underneath the Western Wailing Wall. It was dated to 20 AD, which is the coin was of Valerius Gratus, who's the prefect of Rome under Tiberius Caesar. And we know that, or we believe that Herod died about approximately 4 BC. So 24 years after Herod's dead, they find this coin under the lowest stone in the Western Wailing Wall. How could that have been built by Herod the Great? Because it's a quarter century after. So that Western Wailing Wall, those Herodian stones are not Herodian stones, as people say. Those stones there, they very well could be from a Herodian project before, but scavengered from that and reused in the wall. But that, that coin is hard evidence that that wall cannot be during the time of Herod. So people need to really look at the evidence. The evidence, you can't argue with the evidence. The evidence is there. And the evidence shows that that is probably the Roman fort. What we have the Temple Mount today is a Roman fortress, Antonia, that housed the 10th Roman Legion. And then just below that in the city of David, in that 12-acre area that was originally held by the Jebusites that David took over, is the place of the temple. In fact, Scripture says it's the temple. Was it 2 Chronicles says 3:1? I think it says that the temple was built right where David bought the threshing floor from the Jebusite. That's in the city of David. I mean, how can you argue with Scripture saying that? It's telling us that's where the temple was built. So we need to really pay attention to what the Bible is saying and not what man's traditions are telling us.
Well, certainly the scriptures for more than 1,000 years, or almost 2,000 years, was telling us that Mount Sinai was in Arabia in the book of Galatians, and nobody was taking it serious until the 1990s. 1,900 years later, we find that the Bible is telling us, but nobody's reading it, probably because there's always that sense that if you read something that is not consistent with what you believe, you tend to disbelieve what you read rather than what you think. And that's the problem that you have with that presupposition that blinds people to where the truth is. I've got another question here. This is from Brian. He is from Canterbury in the UK. He says, as far as I'm aware, the Lord's always commanded the altars, and so I presume tabernacles, were to be built in low places, as the high places were used for the ungodly acts of false worship. Therefore, it makes sense that the city of David, which was sited on the threshing floor, near the threshing floor, to be the actual site of the Holy Temple. Since the Jews obviously knew that God's aversion to high places, what caused them to assume that it was on the Temple Mount in the first place? And he asked one other question. He says, would the consequences, what are the consequences for the Jewish religion if they acknowledged the Temple Mount wasn't the true site, especially in the light of the recent riots taking place there? So he's asking you to speculate. But let's take, I mean, we've addressed it to some degree, but have you had any formal contact with the Jewish community there in terms of their reaction to you? Or it's just been the Archaeological Society and
well, I'm going over to meet with them this next trip. I've been invited with several top scholars and stuff. This next trip's going to be pretty amazing. I mean, I can't tell you who the officials are, but they're pretty high up there. And one of I think the gentleman from UK just asked about how did it get started. I think that was part of his question.
Yes.
About the temple. You have to realize when the Romans got there about 63 BC and they stayed to about 289 AD, so they're there over 350 years. They had to have a large structure to house the 10th Roman Legion, which was about 6,000 soldiers and about 4,000 support personnel. And we're talking about bakers and the people who took care of the horses and all that. So it was a large, let's say roughly 10,000 people. They needed a large structure, and it had to have been a high-walled protective fortress because there was the Jews were always rebelling and going through riots and stuff like that. So what people say is the Temple Mount today was the Roman fort, and it was a fortress, and it's designed and it's the same size as other Roman forts throughout the area. So what happened was when the Crusaders went over there in 1099, on July 13th in 1099, breached the wall, killed all the Muslims, killed all of the Jews, and they're there and they're looking up at this Muslim shrine, what we know today as the Dome of the Rock or the Mosque of Omar, depending on how people describe it. But it's the Dome of the Rock or the Holy Enclosure. It's just big gold dome. And so there was a crescent moon on top of it. So one of the Crusaders went up there, ripped off the crescent moon and put up a gold cross and called it Templis Domini, which is the temple of God. Or the Lord's temple. And so then it started, The people said, well, this must be the place of Solomon's temple. And then in about 1178, there was a Jewish rabbi named Tudela that was very charismatic and said, look, we're arguing about where the temple should be. There was about 4 sites at that time suggested. And so he just said, let's just settle on this. And they did. And from that point on, no one's really argued too much about where the temple's located. So a tradition was born in about 1099 on July 3rd that's the temple. And then from that point on, it's just become part of our culture that's it.
Well, there's been some other research done on the Temple Mount, of course. In the mid 70s, there was 70s and 80s. There was the work done by Asher Kaufman, where he was using some topographic information to place the temple residing over the Dome of the Tablets, which is north of the Dome of the Rock, and that was very popular for a while. And they saw that as a nice compromise for the Jews to be able to build their temple, and the Dome of the Rock to not be disturbed. And then years later, in the 90s, a guy named Tuvi Segev came along, an architect, and came out with what was called the Southern Conjecture, and that was the idea that that the temple had to be much lower than the current paving on the Temple Mount. And so, but that didn't really gain much traction, although he had some good evidence in terms of some of the aqueducts that were bringing water to the Temple Mount area coming from Hebron. And so there's always been that sense of, where is it even on there? And are they discovering stuff? And that's why when Ernst comes out with his book in 2001, the temple that the Jews forgot, and then the research that you've done and others, it just sort of opens up the issue now. And the thing I think that is most interesting to me is of the discoveries that we've talked about in this interview, the one that has the greatest prophetic impact is the location of the temple. Because it's something that is an issue that will be important in the end time scenario. We have a question here from Greg. He is from a ministry called All About God. And he writes a question. He says, if the temple is rebuilt in the incorrect place, that is the current Temple Mount, would it still biblically qualify as an abomination of desolation in the eyes of the Lord, or could it actually be part of the great deception or strong delusion? What possible prophetic scenarios could be logically conjectured based on this new evidence being refuted or accepted by the temple builders? In other words, what he's asking is, a question of us trying to guess what would happen if they carried on trying to build on the Temple Mount. Well, I think both you and I know that the Jews have little chance of ever breaching, let alone even stepping on the Temple Mount to build anything. And many have postulated the idea that maybe one of the things that the Antichrist will do will be to broker some kind of a deal with the Muslims to allow the Jews to build something up on the Temple Mount. Well, this new discovery really sort of eclipses all of the importance of the need for that, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And I was talking to you before the show about what I came across this week. I'm doing some research on the location of the Crucifixion Site, which is turning out to be pretty fascinating, because if you relocate the temple, then you've got to relocate the site of the crucifixion. There's a lot of exciting things coming about because of that. But let's say that the Temple Mount is going to have there's going to be two temples in the future, the Tribulation Temple, and then that's where the Antichrist goes in and declares himself God, and the abomination of desolation. Then we have the Millennial Temple that Christ will build. The Bible actually says, Christ says, I will build, he's going to build it, and all nations shall be gathered unto it. So that, I believe, is going to be definitely in the city of David, over the Gihon Springs, laminated over the other temples, the Solomon's Temple, Zerubbabel, Herod's, and now this future Millennial Temple. This Tribulation Temple really has me puzzled as to where it's going to be. But let's say the Antichrist does broker a deal and allows it to be on the Temple Mount in the form of, let's say, a tent or a tabernacle or a smaller dwelling or something, and causes this great peace to come across the world. I mean, it could happen. Our mind has to stretch pretty far to see that now, but it could happen because of the Antichrist bringing in this false sense of peace. But when Christ returns in Zechariah, it says that the mountain of Olives splits from east to west in a great valley. Estimates have been 15, 20, 30, 50 miles in either direction of this great valley in Jerusalem. That the Mount of Olives will go, north part of it will go north to south, and this great valley will go east to west. Well, if you go east to west from there, and if you go from the Mount of Olives due west, it goes directly through the Dome of the Rock and the Temple Mount, which, according to Scripture, will be, if I read it correctly, a great valley means that it's going to fracture east to west. It would break in half the Temple Mount, the Western Wailing Wall, the Dome of the Rock, all be gone. And so if you read Scripture, when Jesus returns, his feet will be on the Mount of Olives, his great valley goes east to west. That apparently is what's going to happen. So I think a lot of people are going to be stunned when they see this great big stone fortress split in two, and the Dome of the Rock literally split in two.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you teased us a little bit there. It sounded like there was another project in the pipeline behind the temple. What can you share with us? I know you don't like to get things out too much,
Yeah,
but you teased us a little bit there. What is
talk
this
a
new
little bit.
location of the crucifixion? You're going to make you've made the Muslims mad, you made the Jews mad. Are you going to make all the Christians mad now? What are you doing?
Yeah, I'm gonna run the bases on this one. The crucifixion site is tethered to the temple in a lot of different ways, and a lot of verses, and a lot of history, and a lot of historians, Eusebius and whatnot. And starting to research, I'm finding that the Garden Tomb, Gordon's Calvary, and also the Church of the Holy Sepulchre have some real problems with it that are insurmountable as allowing them to be the site from a biblical and an extra biblical standpoint. But if the temple is located in the city of David, then all of a sudden it opens up a whole new world to where the crucifixion site will be of Christ. So we started in on this project, and I've been awake every night for this week. I can't tell you, I haven't had hardly any sleep, because what we're finding is absolutely astounding. And I would say within 3 months I'll be allowed to go public, and I maybe come back in your show here and I'll tell folks what we found. It's absolutely heart-stopping, the evidence that we've uncovered and the stuff that we are uncovering daily about this. So stand by. We could have some pretty amazing stuff to share really soon.
That's an inducement and a half. I know that you shared some of that early rough draft research with me before we went on air, and I have to admit there's some very compelling information. And even going back to our trip that you and I took to Israel, some of the photographic evidence that you said, take a picture of that because that's going to be significant. Now, seeing where that's being placed in this new research is interesting. And I would encourage people, if you want to stay on top of that, to get connected online to both Base Institute and Koinonia House through Facebook, facebook.com/Base Institute, or facebook.com Koinonia House, and like and join that group, and that'll be the place to get the up to the minute information. And if you don't leak it, Bob, we will first. So you better hurry up.
I know. I tell you, I'm more excited about this crucifixion site, the evidence we're finding, than anything I've ever done.
Well, gosh, that sounds fantastic. And Bob, thank you once again for being with us on the broadcast. I know that those that have been following your career are always excited about the next project that the Lord seems to lead you into, and that fresh way of using the Bible as your only compass and not the traditions of men. So God bless you for that. And for those of you viewing either live now or later through our kitrust.org streaming channel or through YouTube, encourage you also to seek God with your whole heart, and you will find Him. So may God bless you as you continue to study His Word. God bless you.